What to expect during this weekend's G7 summit? All of that and more, today, May 19th, 2023. Good morning, early birds. I'm Jonathan Lehrfeld, and this is the Early Bird Brief, produced by Defense News and Military Times. First up, the war in Ukraine will likely be the focus as the leaders of the world's most powerful democracies gather for the Group of Seven summit in Hiroshima, Japan. The Group of Seven is an informal group of leading industrialized nations. It consists of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida met yesterday, aiming to showcase the strength of their alliance ahead of the summit.
The bottom line, Mr. Prime Minister, is that when our countries stand together, we stand stronger. And I believe the whole world is safer when we do.
Here's why it matters. In addition to the war in Ukraine, the group will also likely focus on tensions in Asia. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters what is on tap for the summit.
Obviously, the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, looms large and will be a significant topic of conversation. There will be discussions about the state of play on the battlefield. There'll be discussions about the state of play on sanctions and the steps that the G7 will collectively commit to on enforcement in particular.
The attention on the war in Europe comes just days after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky completed a whirlwind trip to meet many of the Group of Seven leaders. The G7 is also awaiting the possibility of renewed conflict in Asia as relations with China deteriorate. They are increasingly concerned about what they see as Beijing's growing assertiveness, among other things. There is a fear that China could try to seize Taiwan by force, sparking a wider conflict. China claims the self-governing island as its own and regularly sends ships and warplanes near it.
Of course, the common concerns and issues associated with the policies and practices of the People's Republic of China will come up. And I think you will see coming out of this summit alignment and convergence around the fundamental principles of our approach to the People's Republic of China.
Japanese Prime Minister Kishida also hopes to highlight the risks of nuclear proliferation during the meeting in Hiroshima. The city is a location of the world's first atomic attack at the end of World War II. The prospect of another nuclear attack comes amid increasing North Korean nuclear threats and missile tests, plus Russia's threats to use nuclear weapons in its war in Ukraine. Also, China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal. In case you were curious, the first summit was in 1975 as the G6 before Canada joined. Russia later joined to form the G8 in 1998, but was expelled after Moscow's 2014 annexation of Crimea. A notable inclusion at the summit is U.S. ally South Korea, which has drawn closer to Japan as their relations thawed in the face of shared regional security concerns. Biden is expected to hold a separate three-way meeting with his Japanese and South Korean counterparts. The president was expected to make a historic stop in Papua New Guinea and then travel to Australia after the summit. Those plans were scrapped earlier this week to focus on the debt limit debate in Washington. Another important story: General David Alvin, the Air Force's number 2 officer, is reportedly the frontrunner to become its next chief of staff. Alvin is a career mobility pilot and strategist. He has served as Air Force Vice Chief of Staff since November 2020. According to a handful of current and retired military officers and experts, he is the service's internal pick for chief. The Air Force's current top officer, General C.Q. Brown Jr., is expected to earn President Joe Biden's nomination for chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Sources for this story were given anonymity to discuss the topic. Some of them said they also know who is in line to take over Alvin's current role. That would be Lieutenant General Jim Slife, the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations and a leader in the Special Operations community. Here's why it matters. If nominated by Biden and confirmed by the Senate, Alvin and Slife would take over the third largest branch of the armed forces. They would manage a nearly $180 billion portfolio spanning around 689,000 uniformed airmen and civilians. They would also inherit a sweeping effort to modernize the service's inventory of decades-old aircraft, adapt the force to the digital era, and encourage young Americans to enlist. Sources said the nominations aren't a done deal, but that the race has been stable for a few months. An Air Force spokesperson said it's premature to comment on whether Alvin is in line for Chief of Staff. Other potential picks could include U.S. Transportation Command boss General Jacqueline Van Ovost or Pacific Air Force's boss General Kenneth Wilsbach, who was recently nominated to lead Air Combat Command. In other news, the Supreme Court may weigh whether it is constitutional to court-martial retirees. For more on this, Marine Corps Times reporter Irene Lowenson breaks it all down for us.
Irene Lowenson, Marine Corps Times reporter extraordinaire, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Simone.
So, you got an interesting case that potentially might make its way in front of the Supreme Court. So, what's this case about?
So there's this retired Marine Staff Sergeant, Stephen Larrabee, who, after his retirement, sexually assaulted a bartender in Japan and filmed it, and he admitted to that. And then he was court-martialed, and because he pleaded guilty, he was convicted. But he now is saying, hey, I think my conviction was unfair because I was a civilian. I shouldn't have been tried under military law. So he was in the Fleet Marine Corps Reserve, which is essentially a retirement status that's for people who enlisted in the Marine Corps and served for more than 20 years, but less than 30 years. They still receive some retainer pay with the understanding that they might be called back to service in the case of a war or national emergency or something like that. But for the most part, they're basically retirees, civilians. And he argues for that reason, it shouldn't be legal for him to be tried under military law. And he argues that it's a constitutional issue. So there's a clause of the Constitution that gives Congress the ability to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. And his point is, I wasn't a part of the naval forces when I committed this crime, and I shouldn't have been tried under military law. Now, the government argues, yes, you were. You were receiving payment to be on call in case you needed to be back in the service. That's at the heart of the disagreement here.
What are the chances that this case will actually be heard before the Supreme Court? Don't they receive a lot of petitions annually?
So yeah, the Supreme Court receives 7,000 to 8,000 petitions for certiorari, basically saying, hear my case, every year. And they accept about 80 of these petitions. So it's always dangerous to read the Supreme Court tea leaves. You never know. But statistically speaking, there's not a huge chance that this case will actually make it before the justices. In fact, in 2018, Larrabee tried to get the justices to hear his case, and they declined. But that may have been in part because the lower appeals courts hadn't quite resolved the issue. Now Larrabee says the lower appeals courts have resolved the issue, although not in a way that he likes, and so that's why he's appealing it. But it's hard to tell. In general, most petitions for certiorari don't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. And so, broadly speaking, what could this mean for military retirees?
This wouldn't just apply to those who retired from the Marine Corps. There's also something called the Fleet Reserve, which is basically the equivalent for the Navy. But Larrabee also said in his petition that his case would not just apply to retired Marines and retired sailors, but also retirees from across the services. There have been some discussions, especially right after the January 6th attack on the Capitol in 2021, where some were saying, hey, some of these people who stormed the Capitol are retirees, and so they should be tried under military law. That hasn't really been borne out. Larrabee said in his petition that he has concerns that service members or retired service members could be tried for any number of things that are illegal under civilian law and illegal under military law, or tried in a way where they're not guaranteed the same kind of protections that you are guaranteed as a defendant in civilian court.
Irene Lowenson, thank you for joining us for the podcast today.
Thank you very much, Simone.
Thanks, Irene. For more conversations like that one, please like and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Also on the radar for today, prosecutors revealed in court documents this week new details about the suspect in the high-profile leak of classified Pentagon documents. They said superiors of Jack Teixeira, the Massachusetts Air National Guard member charged with the leak, had raised concerns internally on multiple occasions about his handling or viewing of classified information. Justice Department lawyers made the disclosure in court papers, urging a magistrate judge to keep Teixeira behind bars while he awaits trial. A quick reminder, Teixeira is accused of sharing highly classified documents about top national security issues in a chat room on the social media platform Discord. He has not yet entered a plea. Prosecutors filed in court a September memo from the Air National Guard. It says Teixeira was observed taking notes on classified intelligence information and putting them in his pocket. It adds that Teixeira was instructed at the time to no longer take notes in any form on classified intelligence information. Other memos say a superior was made aware that Teixeira was potentially ignoring the cease and desist order on deep diving into intelligence information, and that he was again observed viewing information that was not related to his primary duty and was related to the intelligence field. Teixeira's lawyers want the judge to release the guardsman to his father's home, arguing he did not attempt to avoid his initial arrest, even when media outlets released his name ahead of it. The judge heard arguments from lawyers over the detention late last month, but is expected to hear more arguments today on prosecutors' detention request and issue a ruling. And now, here are some other stories that we're hearing chirps about. The Department of Defense asked Congress to authorize the transfer of nuclear-powered submarines to Australia as part of a trilateral agreement that also includes the UK. Russia fired cruise missiles against different parts of Ukraine earlier yesterday in the latest test of Ukrainian air defenses. Ukrainian officials said they shot down most of them. The commander of the Army's Pueblo chemical depot in Colorado received a suspension for his leadership role amid an ongoing investigation. And be sure to tune in on Monday for an episode about dress and appearance standards across federal agencies, including the Department of Defense. And on this day in history, in 1935, the British military officer T.E. Lawrence, who inspired the 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia, died. That's it for us this morning. To get more of the top stories and breaking news, go to defensenews.com/EBB to subscribe to the Early Bird Brief newsletter. Please give us a like, rating, and a comment wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media @defense_news and @Military Times. The Early Bird Brief is hosted by me, Jonathan Lehrfeld, and produced by Zimone Z. Perez. Today's episode features stories by The Associated Press, Rachel Cohen, and Irene Lowenson. Our editor-in-chief is Mike Bruce. Have a great day.